go ahead and start. Let people come in as they will. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Alexandra Schneider. I am the manager of public programs for the History Center, and I'm very pleased that you all have been able to join us this evening for our conversation with John Wasik. Before we get to our main event, just a couple housekeeping matters. As always, I'm sure we're all Zoom experts by now, but if I have not already rudely done so for you, if you could mute your own microphones, that would be very much appreciated to cut back on feedback or any noise interference during the program. In the upper right-hand portion of your screen, you will see a little button that says View. You can toggle that to select how you would like to view the program. You can either have everybody in tiny boxes and our main speaker in a large box, or you can view everyone Brady Bunch style. It is up to you. In terms of questions through the program, at the base of your screen, you will see a little chat box icon. If at any point during the program you have a question, go ahead and type it in there, and you can select my name, Alexandra Schneider, as the recipient. And when we get to our Q&A section, I can go ahead and read those out for you. A very quick but very sincere thank you to Maddie Dugan, who has very generously sponsored our Zoom programming. We're really happy that we can continue to bring these to you. And now I want to just give a brief introduction. Our speaker tonight, John Wasik. John is the author of 19 books and has spoken about his work all across North America. As a journalist, he's written for the New York Times, Forbes magazine, the Wall Street Journal, Reader's Digest, AARP, Barron's, Fortune.com, Money, and Washington Monthly, and was a columnist for Bloomberg News, Reuters, and other national publications. In 2018, John was named an Illinois Rhodes Scholar for the Illinois Humanities Council, and he's here tonight, of course, to discuss his latest publication, Lincolnomics, How President Lincoln Constructed the Great American Economy, which is available from several local retailers, including the Lake Forest Bookstore, and we will give you information on where to find that a couple times through the program. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Alex. Very, very kind introduction. And I want to thank the History Center for this very great privilege to talk to you tonight. I'm going to talk about the Lincoln story that most people are probably not aware of. As you know, there's been more than 16,000 books written about Lincoln, and most of them are pretty straight biographies. They tell the story of his leadership during the Civil War, the Gettysburg Address, the inaugurals, you know, his growing up in Illinois and Springfield, the log cabin origins, all those things. And when I started this book, you know, having lived in Illinois all my life, I always saw Lincoln as this monumental person, this icon of the past that you can never avoid in Illinois, no matter how much you try. Is on the license plates and just everywhere, Lincoln Avenue and Lincoln Highway. I was born on the Lincoln Highway. But what's interesting about Lincoln is that few people have looked at his economic philosophy. And this is what I really focused on in the book and why I wanted to write it, and thought that it was different than all the other more than 10,000 books on him. But I'll start the story in 1860. And this really brought me to the History Center because I was looking for something that nobody had found. And that was a copy of his speech. He was in Waukegan on April 2nd of that year. He gave a speech in downtown Waukegan, and presumably it was about slavery. At that time, Waukegan was not that very old of a town. The railroad had just come there a few years earlier. Lincoln came up from Chicago after a court case, and he started to give this speech. And really, 20 minutes into the speech, what happened was somebody ran into the room and said, "There's a fire, we have to put it out, there's a fire." And at first, the Republican abolitionist sponsors of the speech said, "Oh no, that's a trick. That's just a trick from the opposition designed to stop him from speaking." And then a couple other people ran and said, "No, there really is a fire." So they managed to convince Lincoln that they needed to get the bucket brigade going, and Lincoln joined them. He goes, we might as well help them put out the fire. And there was a grain warehouse that was burning down. So Lincoln departed with the group to put out the fire. Now, what's not really known about what he said is really interesting, because I tried to find the speech all sorts of places, including the History Center. And when you find something like that, it's the Rosetta Stone, it's the Holy Grail, is like you could be king of the world in terms of 19th century history. But I didn't find it. I found some contemporary accounts that were second, third person. And more puzzling to me was he spent the night at the home of the mayor. His name is Elisha P. Ferry. It was a little house just north of downtown Waukegan. I visited the other day, and you'd pass it a million times. I know I have, without knowing that Lincoln had spent the night there. And as a biographer, you think, well, I wonder what he talked about with Mayor Ferry. I wonder what his worldview is at the time. We all know that he was against slavery, but what else was he thinking? Well, and that led to the book. What else was he thinking? He was thinking about the economic development of the country, about economic equality in terms of granting it to everybody. As we know, he started out in very humble beginnings. Principally, he wanted to know, and he managed to achieve this during his lifetime, how do you ascend from being a backwoodsman, a rural farmer, to President of the United States? And that's really the focus of the book. What really propelled him in his earlier years, and this was a big surprise to me, was not slavery. It was this idea that we should have internal improvements, which today we call infrastructure. In his time, when he first got involved in politics in Springfield in the 1830s, that meant canals. Canals that would connect river systems. At that time, it was very difficult to get to from Springfield to the Illinois River, which got you into the Mississippi and down to New Orleans. So he wanted to build a canal, and that was one of his first campaign planks. He called it the Sangamon Canal. And he did finally get elected. He failed the first time. He's off to the Black Hawk War, and he served a couple terms in the General Assembly. And he did succeed in finding an ally for building another canal, which became even more famous than the Sangamon Canal, and that was Stephen Douglas, his lifetime rival. So Douglas and Lincoln and some other legislators from Springfield in that part of the state teamed up to fund the Illinois and Michigan Canal. If you've ever been down there, it's a very lovely corridor, roughly south of Joliet to where it ends at LaSalle. It's 96 miles from the Chicago River down there. And the really brilliant thing about it was that it did connect Chicago to the Mississippi River system. But more importantly, when the Erie Canal was finished in 1828, it connected the whole eastern seaboard in the port of New York to the Great Lakes, to Chicago, making Chicago a major port, and then, of course, down to the Mississippi. So this was a game changer. Economically, all the towns along there prospered, and Chicago was the biggest beneficiary because it was this literal commercial hub. Became a center for timber, for manufacturing, for shipment of commodities, and it literally became the most important port in what was then the Old Northwest, later the West. And when the railroad came along, and again, Lincoln voted to fund the railroad, and at first, the railroad was thought as something that was too expensive to do. So the low-hanging fruit was the canal. The canal that he proposed was never built, but along the way, he became an urban planner. He literally surveyed and platted a town right at the intersection of this canal and the Illinois River. Was never built. The town was Huron, something that was really remarkable I found in the archives. It was like, I didn't know Lincoln was an urban planner, but he really was thinking ahead. He had this vision of the country that was expanding because people in places where he lived and in rural areas, any place, if they didn't have access to transportation to the infrastructure to get them somewhere, we should build it. So that was the whole internal improvements agenda, originally advanced by Henry Clay. He called it the American system. Also, there were tariffs that funded these projects that were imposed by the states. And really, the first thing that took off in 1830s, it was called the era of good feelings, were these massive improvements in canals and ports, because at that time the river systems were our interstates. Gradually, the technology for scaling up on railroads improved. The locomotives got faster. We gained the ability to make steel in large quantities, making rails and ties and all those sorts of things, and that really took off in the 1840s. But by 1848, Lincoln was in Congress. He served only one term. And again, he wasn't quite talking about slavery yet. He was still talking about internal improvements. In one of his longest speeches, and we're all trained to know the Gettysburg Address and the inaugurals. They were not long speeches, but he had some really long speeches where he would talk about the importance of canals and ports and internal improvements. And he did this when he was in Congress. He thought the Mexican War that President Polk had started was a bad idea, because we should have been spending money on, getting farmers' goods to markets. And that was part of his economic philosophy. And he actually, when he was coming back from Washington after his only term in Congress, he went down the Illinois and Michigan Canal, traveled with his family, and got back to Springfield that way. So he saw what was going to happen to not only Chicago, but Illinois, and for that matter, the rest of the country. And by that time, the railroad was just getting going, and it wasn't complete. But part of that first wave of funding internal improvements was the creation of a land grant railroad called the Illinois Central. And by the time he was president, it was such an extensive system that ran throughout Illinois, and of course connected to the ports, the cities, the major market towns, and of course the Illinois and Michigan Canal. It became the longest railroad in the world by the time he was president. So it was a very significant development in the history of Illinois that was so important that by 1900, just the sheer commercial volume and the numbers of people coming into Chicago created the fastest growing city on the planet by the turn of the century. So that's how important these improvements were. Now, of course, he had a very, very storied legal career. He was a good lawyer. He defended just about everybody from people down his way who were accused of murder to the Illinois Central Railroad, saved him millions in taxes. But the most interesting case to me happened just before he ran for senator in 1858. There was a case involving, and this is always disputed by historians as to exactly what happened. So there was a bridge that was built over the Mississippi River at Rock Island. There was a bridge that was, really opened up rail traffic to the other side of the river. And what happened was a steamboat came up one day and either lost control or deliberately crashed into the bridge. Now, at that time, the bridges were made all of wood. So the boiler blew up, the ship blew up, it burned the bridge down. It's a horrible catastrophe. Nobody was killed, but there was a lot of destruction. So what happened was the steamboat operator sued the bridge company and the railroad, claiming this was an impediment to river traffic. And the steamboat industry, thought they were entitled to own this river, that nobody should build a bridge across it, and it was going to end their trade. Well, it didn't, but they sued, and Lincoln was on the team defending the railroad and the bridge company. The first trial ended in a hung jury, but eventually it was thrown out. But Lincoln made this really interesting argument during the trial. He said that, this is not just a bridge. It's not an impediment to commerce. It's a public amenity. This is something that's important to the entire nation, because, you know, we have to cross this river, and eventually the railroad's going to go all the way to the Pacific. And as we know from history, you know, during the 1840s, the whole movement west was very intense. There was no way, a good way of getting there. The Transcontinental Railroad was a very hot idea. It was the hottest infrastructure idea of its time before Lincoln got elected. But they just couldn't get it done. There was a lot of tension between the South and the North. No less than Jefferson Davis had been an Army engineer who said that, you know, putting a rail crossing up at Rock Island, where there was a federal arsenal at the time, was a bad idea. And of course, he wanted the southern route, either through St. Louis or Point South. That didn't happen. And of course, the whole idea was that, you know, the Transcontinental Railroad, the crossing of the river up north, would disproportionately benefit the North. And the South, of course, wanted to expand slavery, wanted to preserve slavery, and it wanted to have those trade routes using rail. So by 1858, we see Lincoln running for Senate against Stephen Douglas. And of course, he lost that, but he becomes very famous in terms of what he's arguing for. And by this time, he is arguing against slavery. He argues that slavery will die a death of attrition. And he's not like Stephen Douglas, who's really saying, well, we should have popular sovereignty, that the states out west should decide whether they want slavery or not. Lincoln says we shouldn't expand it. We can't have two systems. House divided, you know, against itself cannot stand. And he's talking about economic systems. And more importantly, I read all of his speeches up until that time. And then I reread the Lincoln Douglas debates. And in the first debate, he's in Ottawa, Illinois, which had been really one of the canal towns that really prospered. If you've ever been down there, it's where the Fox River meets the Illinois, and they literally had to build an aqueduct of the canal that goes over the river. It was very quite an engineering feat for the time. But Ottawa prospered from that trade, and Lincoln, of course, had his hand in it. But he says in his first debate, you know, that men have the right to earn, you know, the bread from their labor, which is a you know, a sword slash against slavery. But it's more than that. It's this real moral stance for economic equality. It's like, you know, you should be able to advance up the economic ladder. And Lincoln used those words. And it's one of our core American principles. And he really built on that. So he doesn't win, but between the end of the debates and 1860, when he does win for president, he gives a lot of speeches, and he's not always talking about slavery. He's talking about agricultural research. He gave a very long speech at the Wisconsin Agricultural Fair. He gave a series of lectures, again, very, very didactic speeches on the importance of discoveries and inventions. He loved the idea of technology. He loved the idea of invention. He loved the whole concept of innovation in making us a greater country and getting us a chance to ascend that economic ladder. In fact, one of the more interesting things that a lot of people don't know, that Lincoln is the only president to hold a patent. He invented a boat that could be raised above a shallow area. It had this ability to inflate these things that you could push up on poles. It looked pretty awkward, but he actually made a model of the boat during his only term in Congress, and he went into the patent office and said, here's my invention. So he patented. We have no evidence that the boat was actually built to scale, but it was remarkable, and it gave an insight into Lincoln that I think a lot of us don't even know about, that he really was curious about how do you make things better? How do you use technology to improve things? 1861 comes along, and he is the first president to send and receive a telegraph message. And he loves the telegraph. You know, it's messages moving the speed of light instead of on a steamboat or on a, you know, Pony Express or any other really slow way of getting information across. And it changes the world. It's the most significant advance in technology, and he sends a message from Washington all the way to San Francisco. So it's a remarkable thing. And as we know, he spends a lot of time in the telegraph room in the White House during the war, receiving dispatches about different battles. The war goes really badly the first couple of years because he has really some incompetent generals like McClellan. McClellan, as it turned out, he had an early experience with. When he won the suit for the Illinois Central was suing McLean County, you know, down by Bloomington, and they claimed that they shouldn't be subject to property taxes in the way the law was set up, and that was true. And all Lincoln had to do was say, look, this was the original law. They don't have to pay it. Save the railroad tens of millions of dollars, right? Because if that suit would have been won by McLean County, then every county that the Illinois Central ran through, and there are a lot, would have been able to collect taxes from the railroad. So Lincoln wins the case, wins a very significant portion of savings for the railroad, and he gets stiffed. They don't pay his legal fee. So he has to sue the railroad to get paid for his services. And the guy holding up the check is McClellan, is one of his first and least effective generals. So that's kind of an interesting little side note. So what happens when he gets into the White House? Well, the war goes badly, and he's really not a popular president because of the absolute slaughter of the unions, losing left and right. They don't really have they have every advantage. They have more railroad miles, they have more logistical ability, they have more people, they have more ability to manufacture stuff, and yet they keep losing battles. But what's even more remarkable is what Lincoln is still thinking about during the height of this grisly war. In 1862, he signs the Homestead Act, giving land to people who want to settle out west. He signs the Morrill Act, which establishes all the great land grant universities like the University of Illinois. He's inspired by a professor from Illinois College in Jacksonville named Jonathan Baldwin Turner, who came up with the idea of what he called an industrial university, which became University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. I looked at the original papers, and he really came up with this idea in the 1830s, 1840s, and he kept pushing it as a way to kind of broaden the educational foundation of not only Illinois, but the country. And of course, he worked with Morrill to get it passed. The first iteration of the Morrill Act was vetoed by President Buchanan in 1858, but it finally succeeded in 1862 and created this immense system. Now, a lot of people are thinking, well, you know, all these state universities were great. What did they do? Well, the most remarkable thing is that they promoted the idea of not only agricultural research, because we didn't really understand soil science at that time. We were just exhausting the fertility of the soil all across the country. Tobacco was possibly the worst crop. Corn wasn't much better. And we needed to understand, how do we improve productivity, because the population of the country was growing very fast. So these were one of the first systems created to create publicly funded R&D, research and development. In addition, they promoted what they called mechanical arts, which became engineering, technology, things like that. And this was so important. And as we know, Illinois has one of the best engineering schools on the planet. And all the other schools had access to this knowledge, to this education. We were able to develop tens of thousands of new inventions, which allowed for more economic progress. Another significant thing that really happened at the height of the Civil War was that Lincoln greenlighted the Transcontinental Railroad. It was two laws, actually. One was a land grant law giving the land to the railroads. Another one was financing it. And of course, he never lived to see the completion of it. That was in 1869. But it established this transcontinental link that no president had really been able to accomplish. He also created the first income tax to pay for all these things. A lot of people don't know that the Union economy actually grew during the Civil War, mostly because of this flat 3% tax. He established the greenback as the currency, and surprisingly, Washington's picture was not on the $1 bill originally, nor was Lincoln. It was Salmon Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, who actually ran against Lincoln before the end of his term and lost, of course, in 1864. But that literally created a national banking system, which had not really truly existed. That was one of Alexander Hamilton's dreams, and Lincoln kind of put that into fruition. So a lot of those things happened, and then I really got into the whole idea of how did Lincoln inspire the rest of our history? Well, he inspired the idea of the interstate highway system. Before the 1950s, we had these national routes. We had the Lincoln Highway, the Dixie Highway, and they were terrible ways of getting from one place to another. They went through all these towns. There were crooked routes, and you had to stop everywhere. And and even by the turn of the century, 1900, if you wanted to get anywhere from Lincoln Highway, say south of Chicago, where I grew up, to the West Coast, it was horrible. I followed these old pioneer rutted trails, and you couldn't get through the mountains that easily, and through the deserts and the valleys. It was just a miserable way. And by 1919, there's a Army colonel named Dwight David Eisenhower, who led an Army convoy that actually had to see how feasible it was getting from coast to coast using military vehicles, and it was very difficult. And that stuck in his head. And after the war, of course, by 56, signs the Interstate Highway Act, and we have a 40,000 mile system at least, and it works. And that was inspired by Lincoln, because Lincoln would have definitely saw the need for this. So getting us up to speed today is like we have, depending on how many estimates you look at it, at least $2 to $6 trillion worth of repairs, upgrades, water systems, lead pipes, railroad freight junctions. It's just a whole array of things. And of course, the White House is looking at a $2 trillion plan, and it's hotly debated. And I think it's really instructive. And when we look back at history, that we see the tension between this idea that a lot of people, and this was prevalent really up until Lincoln's era, that the national government should not fund this infrastructure plan on such a large scale. And it's still there, and it's there for a number of reasons, but it's very instructive to look at that history to kind of inform us today on why it's important. So the best story I think that I pull out of this is that the construction of infrastructure is more than roads and bridges and tunnels and water systems. There's also a need for social infrastructure. We do need to invest more heavily in education and to public health. I kind of wrote the book backwards, because I started out in the COVID crisis with all the unrest on the streets, Black Lives Matter. It was all part of the picture, and I had to ask the question as a social observer, as somebody writing a biography of an instrumental figure in our history. It was like, well, what would Lincoln do? Well, what would he do about all these things? Well, if you go back to the inspiration for the 14th Amendment, the Equal Rights Clause, equal treatment, he would have embraced creating a more egalitarian social and physical infrastructure. So I know that that's not going to ring true with a lot of people, where they would say, no, the party of Lincoln would never endorse this. I believe, based on his writings and what he actually did, that he would really have a very strong opinion and a strong tendency to act on infrastructure in our time and moving forward. So that's really the book. It was just a pure labor of love, because I got to see different aspects of Lincoln and his life and history. I mean, most of us get taught in school, well, there was a Civil War, and then there was and then there was, the Revolutionary War, and not much in between, but there's a lot. And I was thrilled to find some nuggets of things like the law speech, which I didn't find, but I love the idea of looking for things like that. And the History Center's certainly helped. And also the fact that he was an urban planner, you know, for a very brief period of time before he became a lawyer. So all these things are very important to us right now. And I've been thinking about infrastructure for at least 4 books, and this was how it culminated in our current national discussion. So with that, once again, I thank you for your kind attention. If you have questions, I love questions, so feel free to put them in the chat box, and I think Alex will read them to me. And you know, I love to engage. And I actually prefer to be in the room with people, but we're in the Zoom cave, so we're all going to hear the echo of your questions. So feel free.
Thank you, John. That was fascinating. I think, for me at least, hearing about, the infrastructural developments that were going on when my parents were growing up in after World War II and the CCC and everything, that's so reactionary, and Lincoln's is so sort of proactive and visionary. So I think that's such an interesting juxtaposition. It says so much about him and his ideas for everything and just how innovative he was. So yes, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And while you are doing that, if you don't mind, I'll get us started. I have a question to ask. So, you touched on this briefly, that a theme throughout is Lincoln's belief in equal economic opportunity. And obviously, when we think of his role as, the Great Emancipator, it's largely a conversation between white and Black communities. But I would imagine, and this could be, I may have my history off here, but for a lot of these land grants and constructing railroads and infrastructure projects, were these going through Native American land, and how did their sort of rights or lack thereof or access to economic opportunity, was that something Lincoln ever thought about or addressed?
Well, there were two things going on. One was this doctrine called manifest destiny, which was almost biblical in nature, where white Protestant males said, well, we're entitled to this land, and we're just going to take it from Native Americans. And of course, we know what happened. And I had a section in the book where I did some even deeper research on what it meant to Native American tribes, and they were deprived of millions of acres, and it caused the deaths of tens of thousands. And of course, when they lost their lands, land was the greatest source of wealth in that century, and in many centuries before that. We were talking about billions that they probably could have used to advance their economic station. There's a very good study by the Pulitzer Center, which showed, in the instance of some land grants where Native American lands were appropriated, the Native Americans were not compensated for it. The land was just stolen from them. So that's still an issue we have to deal with. And it's something that we have to look at in even greater depth, in terms of saying, well, how do we level the playing field, with all these wrongs that were really promulgated by these doctrines, and the Transcontinental Railroad and the Homestead Act. I mean, these are things we need to look at.
Thank you. We have a couple questions that have come in. So from John Johnson, did you come across any insight on Lincoln determining the standard width of railroad tracks at 4 feet 8.5 inches?
Oh, that's a good technical question. I don't think that Lincoln really got into that argument. And I know that's been an issue throughout the creation of the railroad system. And that was not, he didn't get into the weeds that much. I think he understood what the argument was, but I didn't find any evidence that, say, during his legal career, that he got into this, or during his presidency. But of course, they had to establish a standard for the Transcontinental Railroad. What I do know is that one of his best generals during the Civil War was a man named Grenville Dodge, who was a railroad engineer from Council Bluffs, Iowa. And Lincoln had actually made a trip to Council Bluffs, which was the eastern terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad, where it was going to start. Of course, it already connected to Chicago through other lines, but he worked with Dodge, and Dodge was severely wounded, and Lincoln took him out of the war, and Dodge, went back to his railroad career and became the chief engineer of the eastern leg of the Transcontinental Railroad. So that's quite a story in and of itself. Again, I'm not really well versed in the technical details, but that evolved during that period of time and somewhat before then.
Thanks.
Lori would like to know if you can talk a little bit about the different ways these projects were funded during Lincoln's era.
Well, the principle of the land grant was actually very simple. The federal government didn't have the cash. The states didn't really have the capital to do these projects outright. So it was a combination of one or two things. One, since the land was appropriated from Native Americans, they had all this land that the federal government had title to, and then they gave it to the railroads. So the first big land grant, of course, was the Illinois Central, and then what would happen was that the railroad itself would have to go and get most of the private financing. A lot of that was overseas money, German money, English money, East Coast money, and they floated a lot of bonds and later stock to finance these operations. So it was really a public-private partnership where, the other example was the Morrill Act, where the land grant colleges, the states were given this land, and they had a choice. So they could create income by either farming the land or leasing the land or selling it outright to somebody else, and then using just a small footprint to create a college like the U of I. So that's one way they did it. In fact, it was a very, very old system. You go back to some of the oldest private colleges, say in Europe, say like Oxford, Cambridge, they actually supported a lot of the university through farming and creating this income to support the institution. And of course, they had patrons, people like Henry VIII and all the kings and queens and stuff. But in the American system, we use the land to create a public amenity, and that was the concept. And Lincoln really believed in education in general and in higher education, and really helping people who were not going to be destined to be in the backwoods or be hardscrabble farmers all of their lives.
Not a question, but a comment. Matthew Chapman says, as I'm sure we all agree, it's a fascinating talk, and that it's hard for us today to even understand what the US was like in the mid-19th century, what it was like to be alive when none of the infrastructure that we definitely take for granted today existed. And people had ideas and plans and saw great things being done, technology being invented. And I bet, especially in Chicago being such a palimpsest in this area, it was a really fun dive to go down.
Well, and this is part of the sort of the revelation of how important infrastructure is. So, you look at the I&M Canal, and you look at it today, there's not much remaining of it. A lot of the part in Chicago is under the Stevenson Expressway. So if you look at sort of the origin of that thinking, it was really 1673 when Joliet and Marquette came through here, and they said, hey, this would be a good place for canal, because what was there at the time, and the French and of course the Native Americans knew this for 1,000 years, was that you had to come down through the Chicago River, not exactly the most navigable river in the world, and you came to this point called Mud Lake, which is right around Harlem and 47th, I think it is, but it's in Summit, Illinois. So you'd have to know where you were. And then that was the portage. So you had to go through this leech infested, muddy, god awful pond that maybe if you were lucky, if the water was high enough, you could just canoe across. But most of the time you just slog through this muck. It would take, days. And it was horrible. And you couldn't do any big transportation things. You couldn't haul goods down there. But if you go down there today, it's actually a National Historic Landmark. And I visited it a couple times. There's a big sculpture there, and they show you the trail and how this place evolved. It literally created the transportation hub of the nation, because even today you have this corridor, this multimodal corridor, where you have containers coming in from the West Coast and the East Coast on the BNS, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad. I mean, you could literally see it from the parking lot of the Mud Lake Portage, and the Des Plaines River is there, and the Stevenson is there, and the Tri-State's not far away. So even today, it's a major route between here and the coast, and all, most of the freight that comes from the coast has to still pass through Chicago. So what happened was that this one idea mushroomed into this idea of multimodal transportation. The containers come off the trains, they go on the trucks. There's still barge traffic coming up and down the Illinois River. It's still the cheapest form of transportation on the planet. So all of this evolved, not only all over the country, but in this one place. And Lincoln saw this, before he was even talking about slavery. He said, this is a great idea, and this is going to transform not only Chicago and the Midwest, but the entire country.
You touched on this a little bit, but John Dodson also wants to know, when you talked about how you came up, with sort of thinking about Lincoln as the economist, but when did you find that it could be an entire new book, that there was enough material to create a whole new work for this?
Well, this is kind of funny. I've done a couple books that touch on infrastructure subjects. At least two books deal with the evolution of the electrical grid. I did one book called The Merchant of Power, which was about Samuel Insull, who was the founder of Commonwealth Edison, and a whole bunch of other things, some great railroads. The North Shore was his baby. He kind of revived it. South Shore, the Royal Elgin, and he was a real, everything he touched, he turned around, and he really was sort of the Bill Gates of utilities. So that kind of led me into this whole wider sort of path of discovery, saying, well, how did this other stuff happen? And I actually talked to a publisher, and they said, well, why don't you do a book on the history of infrastructure? I was like, well, I don't think that would be one book. Like Lincoln's collected works are in 8 volumes, and those are just the letters. So, so I saw this story and I saw an academic paper which described his early interest in infrastructure, and I came to the conclusion that I knew nothing about it. So it became this very compelling other vision of Lincoln. And then, of course, as infrastructure has been sort of on the congressional docket for the last, 20 years, it became more of a lens to see why this was important. What does it mean to people when you have a decent highway or a railroad connection or a high-speed rail? I mean, you can ask all these questions, and they're even advocating for the expansion of the Amtrak network. I love Amtrak. I've been on all but one route, and it still does what it was intended to do. It links a lot of little towns that otherwise would have no access. They wouldn't have airports. They wouldn't have regular service coming out of O'Hare. And this is still important. It still means a lot to a little town in the middle of Montana, or place like say Galesburg, Illinois. It does mean something. It does mean commercial viability. It does get people from one place to another, and it connects the country in a way that I think that we need to revisit.
Abby would like to know if McClellan and Lincoln remembered their prior meeting when McClellan was later a general for him in the war.
Oh, I'm sure they did. Uh, and, the funny thing is that McClellan was all show, and he wanted to look the part of the great 19th century warrior, and he was constantly drilling his troops, and he always complained he was not provisioned enough, and he wasn't ready, he didn't have enough troops, he didn't have enough horses or cannons or whatever, and he just was reluctant to be a general. That was the major problem, and then Lincoln eventually fired him, and this scruffy guy from Galena eventually became his great commander. And in fact, I did a whole section on the Battle of Vicksburg and how important just logistics was in that battle. And Grant and it was a miserable campaign. Grant tried 6 times to take the city. He shot over to Jackson, Mississippi, took that to cut off the rail connections. And that was one reason. And then he had to lay siege to the town, and people were starving there, and they had to surrender. And this was within a day or two of Gettysburg. And that whole campaign opened up the Mississippi, opened up this huge, viable transportation route to New Orleans and global ports, and changed the whole nature of the war. And then Grant was able to move east, and eventually to Appomattox in 1865. But it was, I looked at it in different lenses, like how difficult was it for Grant to get this huge army, and his staging base was originally in Cairo, Illinois, at the end of the Illinois Central Railroad. And there weren't that many railroads down in Mississippi. There was only 1 or 2 routes that he could use. And they literally end up building routes where they needed them. And then when they got to Atlanta, they ended up destroying them. So most of Lincoln's better generals were railroad men, not McClellan, but some of the others. So it was very important that logistics and transportation was there for the Union Army, which had enormous ability to resupply itself.
A lot of sense. Lori would also like to know, what did the political opposition to some of these projects look like for Lincoln?
Well, there was always this sentiment that the national government should not fund infrastructure. And Lincoln actually made the argument when he was in Congress that it's like, look, the Illinois and Michigan Canal looks like it's just going to benefit, Chicago, which was just a dinky town of 10,000 then. But it actually benefits the entire nation. So he was making the argument that it was a national amenity, which indeed it was, because, once they opened up the Erie Canal, the Hudson connected to New York City, which became a great port, which connected the Great Lakes, so you could ship timber and iron ore and all sorts of commodities from one end to the country to the other, which pretty much stopped at the Mississippi. So he really had to fight that battle. In fact, it was James Monroe, one of the founding fathers, who said, we can't do infrastructure on a federal level. It's not even in the Constitution. And he literally said that in an annual message, and that became sort of this mantra of Southern slaveholding presidents, that is like, no, we really can't do this. It's not gonna benefit us. It's disproportionately going to benefit the northern states, which are rapidly industrializing because they had infrastructure. So it was sort of a chicken and the egg sort of thing.
I'm sure that there were a lot of really interesting conversations that went on between Lincoln and his various political team and others. Were there any meetings in particular that you came across where you wished you were the proverbial fly on the wall and could have been present for?
Yes, and that's, God, every person who wants to get into Lincoln's mind always wants to know, what was he thinking when? So Jonathan Baldwin Turner, the original architect of the land grant college, of course, knew Lincoln when he was a young man, and he made a visit to Lincoln, and Lincoln could only take him or meet him very late at night, around midnight, and they had a brief meeting. I would have loved to have been in there to see what they would have discussed. Maybe the future of education, the future of building this great system of higher education, and what did it look like? What did they think about? That I would have loved to have been a part of that. And of course, hearing his speech in Waukegan would have been neat too. So.
Great. Let's see. You touched on this a little bit, but in thinking sort of comparatively between then and now, you describe Lincoln's approach to infrastructure as being innovative and something, that beyond what his contemporaries were really thinking about. How does that sort of framework parallel where we are today with the Biden administration's new infrastructure bill that's looking at broadband and other new technologies? There's a way to sort of think about those together.
And those are really essential questions for us right now. And really because that infrastructure means so much to so many people. So, and I got this question yesterday. It was like, how important is rural broadband? Well, it connects people who are in places where you don't have really good internet connection to the rest of the world. And that's really important. It's just as important as any other part of the infrastructure, like the interstate highway system, the rail system, water systems. It's all important because it's the connection that enables you to transact business, to do remote learning. Of course, during this COVID age, is vital, and not everybody had it, and they were disadvantaged, and that's kind of the inequality baked in the system. I mean, I have really good internet, but there's a lot of people who couldn't get into their virtual classrooms, and they lost out. I mean, and then, you have the question of, like, there's places where we have great hospitals, like in Lake County. And you go to the south side of Chicago, and there's it's very hard to get a decent trauma center down there. And it's, there's a huge amount of inequality baked into the social infrastructure, which puts people at a disadvantage. There's poorer health outcomes, the ability to earn enough money to retire, to have home equity, the things that we take for granted are not equally distributed. And this is something that Lincoln would really embrace as something, as part of his ethos, that, to give everybody a fair chance, you do need to have these other things.
Very true. John has another follow-up question, just more of a practicality question with creating a book like this. You have a lot of material to work with. So how do you collaborate with a publisher and edit it into something that, is interesting and cohesive and, covers everything that you want to cover? Or can I practically cover it in a single book?
Well, I'll be honest with you that any book on history or biography is inherently a failure, because you can't possibly know what was in the mind of the subject you're covering. You can't possibly have every detail. I didn't talk much about the Civil War, and God, I mean, there's volumes upon volumes on the Civil War, the generals, the specific battles. I mean, there's a lot that I, deliberately said, I'm going to focus on this one aspect of Lincoln's achievements, and it's hard to say what are you going to leave out. I mean, I had one section that I had an appendix that I actually started with because it was just a pure delight. It was just kind of a travel log of Lincoln places that I had been to, that I had discovered. There's a Lincoln Heritage area on the way to Springfield that I didn't even know about. I've been down I-55 a million times. I was like, oh, there's a new national area. And there's a Lincoln, not a Lincoln, but the I&M Heritage Canal area is a national park. It goes all the way from LaSalle to Pullman in South Chicago. So a lot of these things you discover along the way, and you're thinking, I got to put that in there. And my publisher actually said, can you take the travel stuff out of there? I don't think we need it. I was like, no, we have to have that, because people are going to want to see this stuff. And, there's a lot of stuff in Illinois I still haven't even seen. And it's always fun to discover it. I mean, it's like you see like a little thing in Bloomington, or you discover a beautiful museum like the History Center, and like things that normally I wouldn't see. And I love museums, so that was fun. So you have to kind of negotiate with the editor. I mean, there's one image that I would have loved to have had them include, and they said, no, we got to do this, and kind of lost that battle. And that's what became the cover. That wouldn't have been my choice. But yeah, and it is a bit of a battle. And you try to get as much as you can in, and then, you know, I kept rewriting the intro because it was, you know, through the lens of COVID, and you know, it was horrendous. All the people that have died and the families that have been touched. I lost 2 friends myself, so you can't ignore those things, and you have to try to make it as current and give it as much shelf life as you can. You know, it's just impossible, but you know, we do the best we can. We try the best, you know, storytelling techniques and putting in new information, and hopefully people will like it.
Well, thank you, John. That was fascinating talk, really interesting. Thank you everyone for your very thoughtful questions. I put in the chat box a couple places where you can find the book, again, Lake Forest Bookstore, and it's also available at diversionbooks.com. And John, you had mentioned one other local bookstore. Can you remind us what the other?
Yes, and I love supporting local independent bookstores. So our friends at Lake Forest have the book. I've signed a few copies at Barber's Books in Vernon Hills, and you can also order online. You know, at one of the bookstores and libraries, museums are my cathedrals. So please try to make a stop or order online to help support them. And they're really one of the bulwarks of our democracy is, you know, just selling books and selling and putting ideas out there. So it's very important.
Great, thank you. Just to wrap up, again, thank you all so much for being here to ensure that we can continue to produce these programs. If you are so inclined, we always appreciate the consideration of a small donation, which can be made on our website. We also always encourage everyone to become a member of the History Center. We have a lot of really wonderful programs and discounts for members on tours. Speaking of tours, we have kicked off our History on the Move series, which is generously sponsored by Roland and Turnbow. We have one tomorrow, which Lori, our curator, will be leading through Market Square, which you can join her for. It's a really interesting tour. We have a program next Thursday. We're kicking off If These Walls Could Talk, which is going to look at the inside stories of some of our historic homes in the area, starting with the Clayton Mark House at 999 Lake Road. Not 999. Yes, it is 999. And then in May, we will also be bringing back our Crabtree Farm tours, which are always wonderful. So have a look for those on our website. Thanks again to Maddie Dugan for sponsoring. And thank you again, John, for the generous giving of your time and sharing your work with us. This is a really wonderful talk. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for your kind attention. And remember that, you know, current events in journalism is our microscope, but history is our telescope, and we can look back and bring it closer to us. So that's so important that you support History Center and history in general. And thank you kindly, and everybody be well.
Thank you, you too. Thanks everyone, have a great night.